Again, a very warm welcome to a new edition of our data talks presented by the Data Innovation Lab, which is a project initiated by the German Federal Foreign Office. Today, again, we have picked a topic that seems to be quite timely and quite relevant. Europe's quest for digital sovereignty, empowering nations with open source. Against the background of things happening geopolitically, I think this is the right time to talk about open source per se, the implications of open source, the opportunities, but also the limits of open source. And as always, we are going to start with a few remarks by our panelists. And then obviously we are going to open up for a round of discussions. And then I invite all participants to actively share their thoughts and start a lively debate together with us. Let me start by introducing our panelists. We have today Hani Iskander. Hani is the Senior Coordinator for Digital Services at the Digital Society Division, International Telecommunications Union. He advises developing countries on digital strategies and policies across different sectors. He has over 25 years of experience, of hands-on experience, and is holding a degree in electrical engineering. Welcome, Hani. Then we have Hilary Carter. Hilary is the Senior Vice President for Research at the Linux Foundation. She joined the foundation in 2021. Prior to joining Linux Foundation, Hilary led a global syndicated research institute focusing on blockchain technology. Hilary holds a Master of Science in Management from the London School of Economics. And then we have Alexander Smoljanitsky. He is currently serving as the Head of Products at the Center for Digital Sovereignty, in German CENDIS. He previously was the Chief Digital Officer of the city of Düsseldorf, and was the co-founder of Parapluie. Alexander, I hope I pronounced it correctly, a digital solutions studio in Berlin. Maybe a word about CENDIS. CENDIS is the Center for Digital Sovereignty. It was founded in December 2022 in response to the growing need for increased digital autonomy in the public sector. But again, Alexander, I think you're going to provide a bit of explanation later on. I would first like to invite Hani to share a few remarks about the topic. Hani, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Hans, and good afternoon, everyone. I think the last few years, the concept and the topic of open source and digital public good gained a lot of traction indeed, and it was part of the digital cooperation roadmap from the UN, and there are a lot of initiatives around it. We interact a lot with governments, and we hear from government officials that they understand to some extent the value proposition, the potential value proposition of open source. They understand how it is critical for sovereignty. They would like to avoid vendor lock-in. They see the potential of reducing costs, etc. But at the same time, there are still some concerns about the use of government of open source for public services, particularly in the government and public domain, both from the government but also from the private sector. And this is what we hear, concretely on the ground, despite all the positive comments and reports that are around. First of all, there is a big question about the sustainability of open source from the governments. The governments are saying, okay, very good, we have this open source, but we are not 100% sure who's behind, who is the owner of this open source, particularly if the community is not that active or it's a small community. There is no local companies in the country who can maintain this kind of open source. So it's a big question mark. I mean, if we don't have someone who can help us in when we have issues or problems, then it's a very it's not a very good gift. Second is that there are some also concerns that, you know, there are some open source like Camunda, for example, who started to be an open source, and then now it's the new versions of Camunda are not open source anymore. So there are licenses involved. So again, it's not because it's open source today, it doesn't mean that it will continue to be open source forever. So again, you are running the risk of some kind of lock-in. Even if you have good open source and even if you have some good community around it, owning the total cost of ownership of open source is not trivial. Usually open source is developed over tens of years, maybe 10 years, 15 years of experience, accumulative experience. Is very difficult to be able as a government or even if a private company to kind of take this open source and immediately own it and maintain it, etc., and build on top of it. It requires a lot of investments, and if there is no strong business opportunity behind it, then it's not going to happen. From the private sector side, I hear it so many times because I was discussing with many people and say, why don't you put your open source, your very good product in an open source? And there is a perception to say, why should I do this? I'm gonna lose my business. I've been developing this software for years, and then you want me to put it for free for anyone and then open it up for competition. Why would I do this? So there is a big question mark about perceived business models. I mean, and it's a legitimate question. Particularly that they don't, even if they want to put it in open source, they don't necessarily fully understand because they are not necessarily involved in those kind of community development, etc. So to develop, if I'm a company and even I'm developing a government project, to put it open source, I need to have some open source experience in terms of versioning, licenses, community, development, etc. And those kind of skills are not necessarily available, particularly when we talk about low and middle income countries. Even if I would like to take an open source that exists internationally and I would like to incorporate it and managing, etc., the total cost of ownership, as I mentioned, is too high. So what should we do? It's very clear that there is a very clear opportunity, but there are those kind of very legitimate concerns that that are making like a barrier for entry and barrier to scale open source in a very trusted manner. So that's why we with UNDP at ITU, we believe that you need to have internal country capacity to really demystify open source for both demand and supply sides. And this is where we are now investing in establishing OSPOs, Open Source Program Office, in countries as a way to have this kind of expert center at the heart of the public sector. So this OSPO is a government OSPO that from one side work with the governments to explain the case for open source and how can you mainstream open source in your policies, in your procurement policies, but at the same time work with the private sector to really try to understand and build capacities around, what is the business model that is viable for open source, etc., etc. So I think there is this huge gap still in many countries that because of the lack of a consistent experience around the case for the use of open source, particularly for public services. And while even when you have enough capacities, etc., I think you need to have very clear policies. Like, for example, some countries said that we will not take any new development of new applications unless there is no existing open source or commercial product available in the market. And if we are to develop new services or new applications, by default, this should be open source. So it becomes a government policy. And I am personally believing that if you are investing public money, it needs to be public code. So public money, public code, I think this is something that resonates a lot with a lot of government people. I think countries like Estonia, who are adopting this kind of approach, they have a very strong argument to say, if you would like to have your software more secure, it's better to make it open so that more eyes are looking at the software and more opportunities to kind of detect any kind of difficulties. So there is a case, actually, a very strong case for making this kind of policy. There is a lot to be done on the procurement policies. And it's not necessarily to say that we are going to give, I think it should be, open source should be compared to commercial options on equal footage based on objective criteria. But it needs to be part of the selection, and it should be like a viable option. And why not even give preference to use open source unless there is absolutely no open source available in the market. But as I mentioned, if there is new development, it needs to be made open source by default. The last point I would like to make is that, bottom line, if we are to talk about open source adoption in countries, those countries need to have local support structures. OSPO is one of those options, but I think there are so many other things. And if you don't have this local ecosystem who really is willing to develop and maintain open source, then it becomes not necessarily a very sustainable option. So maybe I'll stop here. I'm very willing to answer questions in the future. Thank you.
Hani, thank you very much for those insights and for the remarks. And I'll directly hand over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is all yours, and excited to hear from you.
Thank you very much. Those were great remarks. I'm going to share a few slides to help articulate some of my points. And I really, what Hani, what he started his talk with is really the challenges that we face at the Linux Foundation and in the open source community very broadly about how to overcome some of these very real issues around the myths and misperceptions of open source, the challenges that we face. And all of these issues that Hani presented at the outset of his talk are really why Linux Foundation research exists, to help address the state of open source, to identify the gaps, to identify the challenges, but also to provide some data behind the opportunities so that we can inform policy and decision-making, and the importance of having open source be a structured undertaking within the public sector and within enterprises in Europe for the purpose of achieving digital sovereignty. So I want to thank Hani very much for his remarks. Our point of view at the Linux Foundation is that open source really is the fundamental digital foundation upon which all of our global digital infrastructure runs. And understanding that at its core, it represents the pre-competitive layer of the technology stack upon which the differentiated products and the products that drive business value are built, that on their own, they're not enough. But they are foundational. And so they are general purpose technologies upon which the great innovations, the great digital products are built. But to better understand what the open source opportunities were within industries, within technology domains, and very broadly across all industries and domains on issues like, open source software developer realities, sustainability, scalability, license certainty, and license compliance, we have created a mission to publish research and do so empirically to help organizations understand the opportunities and challenges with data. So to date, we've published more than 80 unique projects on these specific challenges, as well as the opportunities, challenges like the talent shortage, opportunities for digital sovereignty in Europe, opportunities for the public sector, opportunities in terms of a planetary context, using open source software for planetary good. So that's a little bit about what I do at Linux Foundation Research is lead empirical studies. And what we found is that the research itself benefits the different stakeholders as we engage in conversations around charting a new future. And I'll say I hold European citizenship. I have Irish citizenship. I live in Canada. And the point of view that I come from is that countries and regions like Europe are craving a new digital path forward, and they're craving an opportunity not to have to rely on technologies from elsewhere. And they're craving this new opportunity to innovate in a cost-effective way to address some critical challenges. And what we're seeing is the opportunities are enormous to use open source software for government, within enterprise, and for the greater good of society when it comes to, prosumer energy production and microgrids. The research shows incredible business value across different industries and the opportunities for governments as well. So I want to step back and say that we've been studying Europe specifically since 2022. Our first report came out on Europe and what the state of open source was in Europe. And we found some very interesting data to show where the most significant gap was really in the public sector. And there was a deep need to correlate public money with public code, and that the public sector could really lower its operating costs and achieve, digital interoperability within government departments and across countries as well. A lot of value to be had, but yet also exposing a number of challenges. The following year, we continued the study, and there was overwhelming evidence from our European respondent community about the role of open source with respect to industry-specific innovation. Many organizations, even outside of IT, were reporting tremendous value from using open source software. The data from the 2022 report, which showed the gap in public sector adoption and contribution to open source, led us to produce a specific public sector study. And I want to spend a little bit of time here going through some of the findings. The good news from this study was that there is tremendous precedent for open source software use in the public sector. And I think increasingly so with Switzerland's comments last year. I know Switzerland's outside the European Union, but all the same, for the Swiss, they've become an open source first country by policy. And I think that sets a very interesting precedent. But EU and EU member states have been championing open source software for over 2 decades. It's been prioritized by the European Commission. There are a number of laws and mandates on its use and reuse, which is very healthy to have policy clarity. The prevalence of open source program offices and OSPOs at national and increasingly municipal levels. The very prevalent belief that public money and public code go hand in hand. The establishment of communities like working teams on the digital commons, and organizations rallying around the opportunities to leverage open source software for digital sovereignty, and as well as the formation of Germany's Center for Digital Sovereignty and the very important Sovereign Tech Fund in 2022. The challenging, the challenge here, though, is that this is not an easy thing. There is, vendors are very well established in Europe. There's a perception that organizations who buy software, they value what they pay money for. And yes, we need to provide better support and better businesses to help with open source software integrate into existing systems. But in terms of economics, lowering the total cost of technology ownership is unequivocal. There is limited awareness of this opportunity among decision makers. There is limited buy-in and investment in open source software in the region, and particularly in the public sector. We have a tech shortage, a talent shortage, and this is not unique to Europe. but it is very real. It is an impediment to achieving a digital innovation and ultimately digital sovereignty. There's a gap in contributions from the public sector to open source repositories, and that probably relates to the technical skills gap that exists, and the very real issue of cybersecurity. And that I think it's very important for policymakers worldwide to proceed with policy in an informed and cautious capacity, that it doesn't stifle innovation. It can be very costly, and I'll elaborate a little bit on that later. Last year, we continued the study in Europe and found some interesting trends, which I'll share here. Yes, the connection between open source software and digital sovereignty is very clear in Europe, but there's also an understanding that global collaboration is still very important, that not all the talent exists in Europe to achieve this, that digital sovereignty and innovation can benefit from the contributions outside of Europe, contributions from Canadians, from Japanese contributors, from Australian contributors, from American, from Chinese contributors, that this is an opportunity to leverage the talent of the world for Europe. The sectors that would benefit, of course, being IT, government, and higher education. The confidence in the security of open source software is increasing. I think there's an awakening taking place that cybersecurity of systems is, and this has been accelerated by the Cyber Resilience Act, is paramount. But the structural gaps in terms of strategy within organizations in the public sector and education, they need an open source strategy. They need to hire talent. They need to have an open source program office. They need responsible policy internally and as well as in the legislature. Earlier this year, we published a study on the awareness and the readiness for constituents worldwide of the Cyber Resilience Act. This applies to any organization that is selling a product with digital elements within the European Union. And what we found was stark. There was a huge level of unawareness and a great amount of uncertainty where the CRA is concerned. 62% being not really familiar at all with the CRA, only slightly familiar. There is a lack of talent and dedicated personnel who can implement the compliance aspects of the CRA within their organization. And early results show that even among those who have contemplated how they're going to reconcile the costs of compliance of the CRA, it's going to lead to a price increase. And that's only from organizations who have considered that. So I invite all of you to explore the resources that are publicly available. Our reports are all in the public domain. Our data sets are open. Please use the research report to your strategic advantage to open conversations about how open source can be leveraged to achieve innovation and, yes, to achieve goals of sovereignty and lower operational costs. And if you'd like, you can scan and stay informed about new research when it's published. We send it out to all subscribers, and you can feel free to get in touch with my email address. I can be research@linuxfoundation.org. So with that, I'll stop sharing and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hilary, and thank you indeed for, let's say, providing us with this perfect overview about research that the Linux Foundation is doing, and that obviously is extremely relevant when talking about the matter. Sovereignty, well, some people sometimes call it to have control over your own digital destiny. That's, I think, from the World Economic Forum. Others, I think, especially the European Parliament, calls it the ability to act independently in the digital world. But obviously, sovereignty is never complete, it's never absolute, but it's always, in a way, relative. And with this, I would like to hand over to Alexander. Alexander, who is, if I may say so, dealing with the practical aspects of open source on a daily basis. Alexander, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks to the to the entire data innovation team for inviting me and also the opportunity to share what we are doing at Zendesk. Maybe some brief remarks. Hans Christian and Hilary, thanks also to you. You've already mentioned us. We are sometimes like a rebel or like a we call ourselves a startup within the state. So we sometimes don't behave as bureaucratic as public institutions usually do, but we have some sort of I think a broad coverage because the topic is as precedent as it could have been. I think what I would like to start is it's not an academic talk, but I think sometimes a definition of digital sovereignty should be there and should be in place. For us, it's having a choice. That means that we don't see the world as a black and white perspective that you either have proprietary software or the open source, but it should be something where everybody could at least have the possibility to choose, which is not always up there. The ability to adapt is the second part of our definition. Sometimes we see ourselves as a public market either as something huge or as something small. It depends on how you look on it in regards to can we have special features within a set of software? Is it possible or not? We think that should be something. And the third one is maybe something rather soft, but having a voice and also an opinion, I think is something that is crucial within the years that we are living in. Some of us always have some sort of background, maybe somewhere in advisory or so. And we know that public institutions tend to outsource the decision-making sometimes to advisors. And I think that it's really important, and nowadays, at least, that we should have our own, like some sort of competence center also within our institutions. And what Hilary basically said also with open source program offices, for example, is something what can be an example for that. Zendesk is, as I already mentioned, a public company, and our mission is to free basically the public administration from critical dependencies. It all started a few years ago when the Ministry of Interior back then made some sort of a research study in which they finally got numbers, what critical dependencies they have. It was 96%, I think, in regards to the tool that we all or many people are using in regards to operating systems and also writing emails and so on. And then we had 3/4 in regards to databases and stuff like that with other providers. And we saw that there is an opportunity and also some sort of a solution needed for that. Zendesk is somewhere, as I said, since we are like a rebel, so we don't see ourselves in one or on one side of a field in regards to games. We see ourselves somewhere on an intersection or on a bridge between both worlds, the public administration, which has certain requirements, and also the open source ecosystem, which can provide answers, but also maybe some trends, which can be then again directed into the public administration. How we do that in a concrete kind of manner are 3 products, which we are currently talking about all the time. One of them is OpenDesk, and that's where I will do some sort of a small deep dive right now. Open Conference is our answer in regards to secure video conferencing. And then we have also a platform on which people can either develop or check out what kind of software already has been built for the public administration, and then reuse it or do additions to that. In regards to OpenDesk, our collaboration suite, maybe some brief remarks and how we see that can or that could answer maybe also some of the questions which Hani has raised in regards to how to have some sort of let's call it the freedom of choosing, but at the same time having providers which can have some sort of longevity within the tool set which you have. I think it's really important for us that we don't build the tools on our own, so it's not something that we just take a few developers, put them into a room, and then they come up with a file sharing service or something like that. What we do is we have some sort of a contract, a framework agreement with, at the end of the day, all the main providers for the tools that we use, and have within these contracts agreements, first of all, that the software which we are using is open source, and it's going to keep that way. All the contributions which we do with, at the end of the day, taxpayers' money, are always within the upstream elements of the product. So whenever, for example, we do optimization in regards to accessibility or so, it's not just for people using OpenDesk solely, but also for everybody else using the tools underlying OpenDesk. And I think this is some sort of a way how on the public side we can contribute to open source, but at the same time also use it wisely, and also at the end also create not only an open source solution, but also a professional service which is underlying it, because nobody, whenever you, obviously we all would love the idea of our email inbox not working, but you don't want to write that into some sort of a forum and say that my email isn't working. You want to have some sort of a red phone, which somebody is going to pick up and tell you how to fix it. One brief element in regards to sovereignty and our understanding of it when it comes to deployability is, I think, the way that we deploy and also offer OpenDesk on our platform, Open Code. We do provide for, I think, already a year and a half, OpenDesk as a free tool which people can download, and as long as you are some sort of a Kubernetes expert or a newbie who is willing to try, you can run it on your own infrastructure. What we also provide are different ways of receiving it as an enterprise version, so you get some sort of a support from the providers, but also a support center which we have. And that's something where we offer for the public administration a software as a service solution whenever you don't have, for example, the capabilities or the capacities within your own data center. You can run it also obviously in your own data center, and then we have some sort of a confidential cloud computing solution, because some even German offices or public administration agencies are not only based in Germany, but also based somewhere outside of Germany, and they need some sort of a fast way to work and to reach their data, and that's why we do confidential cloud computing within international hyperscalers. And we never talk, but we also are able to deploy, and we do deploy OpenDesk also in different kinds of special infrastructures. You can imagine maybe with the illustration what I mean. I think, and that's something that I think everybody who already talked has mentioned, that I think digital sovereignty doesn't end at the state's borders. It's a task which, from our side, in the first place, maybe it's a European task, but also it's a global and international task which can be tackled. We do have a standing cooperation, and actually right now we have, I think, around 350 people at a hackathon in Paris. We work with the French and the Netherlands together right now on providing digital workspace solutions, and we create tools like Docs, which you can see right now, which is some sort of a notepad, which and that was really cool to see that it's not only within the geek ecosystem of people working in public administrations, but also somewhere within Hacker News. So Y Combinator had us for 1 week, for example, a few weeks ago, as #1 tool within their forum. So we do get some slack in that regard. Maybe to round up, Open Code, our platform, provides us with the full circle, so to say, we call it, or we are playing with the name of a Zendesk package. So you get the full deal, basically, that you can have a place where you can gather your requirements, work on your product, do the project management. Even we built or are building OpenDesk on OpenDesk. So all our developers, product managers, and everybody is just using OpenDesk as a product management tool, basically. We provide the releases, we can build them and have some sort of a secure development pipeline, which then goes to the client. And I think distribution is a topic which people don't like to talk about when it comes to sovereignty, but it's a hot topic, I think, for the upcoming years, when we can see what kind of dependencies we have in regards to libraries which we are using. And that's the whole deal which you can get, so to say, with Xendis. And we just started. And as Hans Christian already mentioned, we were founded in late 2022. 2024, the first people actually got a contract, so to say, with Xendis. And now we have just on OpenDesk, for example, started this year, I think around 70,000 users within the public administration, and the trend is going up. So whenever you have questions or you want to read more, visit our websites, which are available also in English, and reach out to me as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Fascinating project, and congratulations to you and your team for providing this open source solution. Thank you, Hani. Thank you, Hilary. Thank you, Alexander, for those very valuable remarks and for getting us started on this debate about sovereignty and the role open source can play in this regard. I mean, having listened to you and with the objective of getting the discussion started, I wanted to take us back to what Hani said in the very beginning, and this is the total cost of ownership. From a very practical point of view, I think this is something that most colleagues, most people that are working in public administration probably fear. The total cost of ownership, taking into consideration that open source typically means that you need people who understand the code, who can review it, especially if you also have code that's coming from jurisdictions that are, not as well regulated as others. Hani, a question to you. What are those coping strategies that you see internationally? How do administrations, public administrations, how does the public deal with this question of total cost of ownership? How do they mitigate, for instance, the lack of having one dedicated service provider that brings the full package, including the software and the services and the maintenance, etc., etc.?
This is a very good question, Hans. Let me maybe share some concrete experience. When you go to countries, and here I'm talking mainly about low and middle income countries, and ask them what kind of open source you are using within your public sector stack. And from what I have seen, and I think it makes a lot of sense, that the main use of open source is really on the lower stack. It's basically on the general purpose. I think Hilary mentioned this, and it's very true. From cloud hosting, OpenStack kind of approach, security, data analytics, visualization, data lakes, a lot of generic and general purpose types of solutions, as opposed to application layer. You know, there is this big movement on DPGs, digital public goods, and many of the DPGs that are promoted are more on the application layer. Like, for example, an open software for social protection programs, or on digital health, etc. I think that many of the countries have started to use this on the lower stack, and I think the reason is because those are more general purpose types of components, the user base is much bigger. And those software has been used in both the public and private. They have been out there for many, many years. The community is much bigger because the use is much wider. And therefore, those software are much more mature and solid. And they have a very strong community behind them. They are already available in different, whether I think OpenDesk is a good example. You have, community edition, you have enterprise edition. So if you look at those types of software, I think this is a way to kind of mitigate the risk, that you kind of start with software solutions, open source, that are commonly used at wider scale. And one of the tasks of the OSPO, the Open Source Program Office, is to try to provide this kind of guidance to public sector on what kind of software they are recommending based on those kind of objective criteria. So it's good to have, and even some countries that they have published their own kind of open source list that they are recommending because they have gone through some validation and testing, etc. So I think, to respond to your question about the mitigation, I think there need to be this kind of center or potentially this OSPO who is doing this kind of evaluation and this kind of assessment on behalf of the government, really looking more at the software that has a wider user base, that has been there for a while, has a very active communities, more general purpose, etc. And then they can even do some additional security and penetration tests to make sure that those software are secure to use. So I think this is a way to mitigate the risk, to kind of have your own selection of software that you can promote within the public sector with a certain level of confidence. So maybe this is something that I've seen that many countries are starting to use it from this kind of perspective.
Thank you, Hani, for those remarks. And I'm directly going to hand over to Alexander in a second with a question that came up in the chat. And I'm just trying to rephrase what Ulrike, who put that in the chat, was writing. Is open source software an orphan that needs to be adopted, that needs to be promoted, that needs to be taken care of, especially when we're talking about public procurement? So who's actually the sponsor of open source? And Alexander, I just thought I hand over this question to you because you are working on open source products on a daily basis. So who's actually making sure that those things that you and your team are doing is duly recognized in procurement processes?
Well, procurement is, I think, a topic for more than maybe a month or so for debates. But I think, if I may add to what Hani also said, from the way that we also experienced how people see open source and see maybe also the need or the ideology, but also the lack of seriosity or something like that in that regard. So I started at Sendis in March of last year, and then I think 3 weeks later or so, the Zeit, which is one of the rather large weekly news outlets, published a story. We were the opener for their economic part in regards to the German answer to Microsoft. And at that point, the headline was amazing, but then they basically said that, I don't know, it's like a startup with like 9 people or something like that. Don't take them serious. And at that point, we were basically just a small group of people. We had our own tenders, which we started and everything like that. And we had from that point on, for the next upcoming few months, we had, if I may say it that way, we had some sort of a shitty PR side on our end because everybody was just making fun of the idea of open source within the public administration. Once we published that we have some sort of an enterprise offering, so to say, which we have because by that the state or the government basically showed that it's not just something where we are investing into something which is a public good, but we also have an interest in using it. The entire media coverage and the perception, so to say, changed because people understood that it's something that is being taken care of seriously. And I think in regards to procurement, there are obviously many sides facing or arguing that there should be some sort of a law or something like that you should have within your tenders, that it should be open source first or something like that. I think it's a question not only on a legal level, but also on what we want to use sort of level. So whenever people are writing the tender, they should think about exactly these sovereignty facts, so to say, which they need to check for themselves it's not a legal issue. I think it's an issue in regards to how we want to perceive the tools that we are using. And if you want to have a solution, you can basically also, that's what we also did. You don't have to have some sort of an open tender where you can write that we want to have a tool which does X or that, but you can switch the idea of the tender and say that you want to have this following open source solution, for example, and you want to develop it further, you want to get professional service for that. And by that, you shift, so to say, the discussion from choosing the software, which is usually the type of tender that you are writing, into you choosing open source solutions, making them better, having some sort of, I don't know, adding a list of licenses, for example, which you want to use or which you want to invest into as a state, for example. And by that, you get open source software without having the debate on a purely legal manner. I think maybe it's a controversial topic. I see a lot of reactions also on Hillary's face in regards to what I've said. But I think it's we should not wait for law to be in place to have open source solutions. We also just saw, I don't know if you are following, but basically even Switzerland, which is a protege open source first state, has huge contracts and huge investments basically also in proprietary software still. And it's not just a legal topic. I think it's a way how we want to perceive and how we want to work on these tools.
Thank you, Alexander. Hillary, you look like you want to react to that immediately.
Well, you know, I was actually looking at one of the questions in the chat, and I wondered if we're going to get to any of those questions in particular. The one that struck me was actually about, it's Balthus Seibold's question about integration of services at the application level. And I think we're doing some research right now on the high level of concentration, if we think about mobile applications, that really the concentration of development is limited to iOS and Android. And those are it's essentially a kind of walled garden and a different silo unto itself. And I think in order to break down those walls and really open up development for different devices in this context, and be in a position to integrate different kinds of services, that open source is the only pathway to begin to think differently about application development, whether it's at the mobile level or any other kind of level. We see this with a data commons, that one of the projects we host at Linux Foundation is called the Overture Maps Foundation. And this was created to share map data, because right now the concentration of map data rests in the hands of Google and Apple. But Overture was created by other stakeholders, namely Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and TomTom, a European mapping group, to create a more open map ecosystem, a more democratized map ecosystem that would enable map data for everyone, a different kind of commons. So I'm very optimistic about the use of open source in this context, and especially in terms of application development and the integration of services. But I think we need to think differently and outside a siloed environment that we currently operate in.
Thank you, Hillary. I'm just picking one of the questions here from the chat, and again, it was Paulina. What are some of the drawbacks of digital sovereignty as a concept, especially related to countries that don't have the necessary digital maturity and infrastructure? Paulina, if you want to come in directly and probably specify the question, most welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Hans. I know which part needs more specification. I'm just referring to the concept of digital sovereignty as a concept, how we see it. Does it actually it seems like I'm pointing towards that, but I'm not. I'm just trying to see all the sides of the coin. Like, I would like to hear what are some of the drawbacks of applying this concept, and especially to less digital mature and less digital countries that don't have the digital infrastructure. If all countries would potentially become digitally sovereign, what would that mean for countries that don't have the access to resources?
Thank you. Hilary, do you want to take that question? Because it's
I'd love
nearly a
to.
philosophical.
Sure, thank you.
It's nearly a philosophical question in a way.
It is. I think the premise is that you don't want to create a fortress, and not all the smart people work inside the boundaries of a given nation state, and that you really, if you're going to create national digital sovereignty, you need to make sure that you've got the right talent. And I think the point that we're trying to make in the open source community is that leveraging the wisdom of the crowd, regardless of where they live in the world, is very, very important. And so digital sovereignty that is not based on a fortress or based on a silo is really the pathway forward. If an organization is going to exclude the rest of the world in its digital undertakings, then it needs to have the right amount of talent within its borders. And that can be very challenging for some of the smaller states. Talent is an equation that it's just one of the essential building blocks for digital innovation, having the right skills, having the right cybersecurity teams. So not being open to others is the most important thing, I think.
Thank you very much. Alexander?
I couldn't agree more. That's why we, for example, also, just right now, the hackathon, we have, I think, something around 8 or 10 other European countries who are joining us in working on that. Even in regards to Paulina, maybe in regards to maybe not having the skill set or something like that available on site, you can also use sovereign products. And I think it's really important that what basically Hilary also said, that digital sovereignty doesn't mean autonomy. And that's maybe something which comes whenever you talk about digital sovereignty. You always have some sort of a story of fear or something like that, of somebody big and maybe dark, who's approaching you and eating you, whereas sovereignty means something that you can basically be like a positive, I think, connotation which it has with it, because you can be strong and also have some sort of, whenever you are sovereign, it doesn't mean you are alone, I think. And we see that also in regards to countries which are asking basically just for services, and that's also their way of using sovereignty in regards to having a choice, I think.
Thank you, Alexander. Hani, you also had your finger up.
Yes, exactly. I would like maybe also in terms of the sovereignty, expand a little bit the definition. It's not only about software solutions, it's also about open APIs definitions and interoperability, because you can potentially work with a kind of a proprietary software, but if you are adopting a kind of standardized interoperable open APIs definition, potentially you can plug and play and switch to an open source or another vendor. So I'm saying that, and there was a very good question actually in the chat by Baltas Siebold, I think. And this is one of the projects that we are working at ITU with other partners on the GovStack, which basically try to break down big systems into reusable building blocks, whether it's ID, payments, exchange, etc., and define some sort of open APIs so that you don't allow one big vendor to own and control the overall digital infrastructure. So you break it down, you allow different vendors to develop their own products. If they adopt those kind of open APIs, theoretically, at least you can switch to other types of providers. And you are part of the sovereignty is that you don't have one big company who owns the whole thing. So you need to break it down to logical, manageable components that could be also managed in a sovereign manner. So I think the sovereignty is not only about open source. I think that it's much more, and I fully agree about the digital skills, because you can end up having a vendor lock-in with an open source provider. I have seen this. You know, if you go to many countries and you propose an open source to them, if they don't have the right capacity, particularly that those local companies, they don't see a business opportunity of investing in owning this kind of software, so they will not do it. And it takes a lot of time to build it. Learning curve is high. So you will end up being dependent on open source providers coming from abroad. So that's why I think also part of the procurement policies is that if you are going to use an open source, you need to have absolutely mandatory local partners working with you. I cannot just adopt OpenDesk, for example, without having a local company who is willing in the near future to be able to sustain it and maintain it. Otherwise, you will end up having very expensive vendors. And by the way, the open source vendors are not as many as in other commercial products. So it's even less. So you are ending in a very bad vendor lock-in, even with open source products. Thank you, Hani.
And this is going into one direction that I thought that I was actually thinking to throw into this discussion, but given the time, I'm not going to do that. And that's actually the customer or client perspective on open source. And this is, at least for some institutions, an epic story where experience is rich, sometimes painful, but sometimes also quite rewarding. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to do that. I would rather like to have a very quick last round of comments, making use of our panelists' expertise today. Hilary, a takeaway, those 1 or 2 sentences that we should keep in mind after this data talk.
Thank you. I think organizations and governments should very concertedly establish a strategy around procurement and policy and talent, and really take advantage of the open source opportunity that exists in a formal capacity. I hope that they can leverage the resources that are available from our organization to help them in their strategy formation.
Thank you, Hilary. Alexander, over to you.
I would say that open source, but also open data, maybe since it's a data talk, are both maybe not goals, but tools in regards to digital sovereignty.
Thank you, Alexander. Hani.
Maybe a call for governments and public sector in general to take open source seriously and really try to explore the opportunities behind it. But doing so, it needs to be based on local expertise. That's why the establishing of a government or a public sector OSPO is one possible criteria. But also be pragmatic. We are establishing OSPOs in countries, and our advice to countries is to say, start with a use case. Start with one use case where you see that there is an opportunity for using open source in this particular use case. It could be on, open source desk solutions or on hosting or on security. Build the capacities, build the knowledge, align the private sector, let them discover the business model behind open source, and then expand. So take it seriously, take it step by step, but based on local capacities and skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hani. And a big virtual applause to all our panelists today. Hilary, thank you for the time. Alexander, for the time as well. Hani, also for your time and remarks. We are about to close. We spent an hour, and that was a very lively debate and very informing discussion. So thank you also to the audience for providing questions, for being with us today. This data talk will be followed up in July with a second part, also focusing on sovereignty. Stay tuned. Check out our website, www.datainnovationlab.de, for further information. Thank you for being with us today, and I wish you all a great evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are on this lovely world. Take care. Thank you very much.